go over the G major cadences in 3 positions. First of all, a quick review of the G major scale. G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. And we can assign each note a number based on in what order we play it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, we are told that some of the most important chords that composers will use are based on the first note of the scale, the fourth note of the scale, and the fifth note of the scale. I think they're the most commonly used, which is why they'd be the most important. Now, what is a cadence anyway? A cadence, it just means you're changing from one chord to another to another. So, this is a cadence because we're changing from one type of chord to another type to another type. That's the name for it, cadence. But then we have the 3 positions, right? So why 3 different positions? Well, turns out composers figured out that if they wanted their performer to play certain chords in quick succession, it would be easier for them to not have to jump around so much. So let's take an example. Let's say if they wanted the performer to play the G, B, D, right, first chord, and then they wanted them to go ahead and go to the one based on the fourth note. Well, it might not be convenient to have to hop like that, especially in a quick sequence. So they figured out that they could have the performer play the same 3 notes that would be in this second triad based on the fourth note if they just flip the order around a little bit. So they could have them stay down here and play G, C, E instead of hop up and do C, E, G. You get the same notes. Different octaves, sure, but it's the same notes, which is kind of more important for the composer as they're meshing all those sounds together. So they came up with these different positions where your hand doesn't have to move much, but you still get those important chords based on the first, fourth, and fifth note of the scale. So let's take a look at the first position. Here it is. We have G, B, D, the first one. That's the same as our G major triad that we played before. Then we have the one based on the fourth note, back to the first one. Then we have F sharp A, D based on the fifth note, and then we have our V7, and then we go back to the first one. So you can see how it's easy to reach. You don't have to move your hand much, right? Whereas if you wanted to do all the triad chords based with the note of the scale on the bottom, you'd have to do this, back to this, and then we have to jump up here, and then we'd have to do this, and then jump back down. So that would be harder. So how exactly are these first position chords changed from what their plain old triad root positions would be? Okay, the first one's not different at all. It's the same. G, B, D. That's easy. You can do that with both hands. Now the second one is based on the fourth note of the scale. If we did our triad there, it would be C, E, G, right? Well, what they did, they decided to go ahead and throw that G down to the bottom. So we're playing the same 3 notes, but we threw the G down to the bottom. So now we have G, C, E. Let's do that with both hands. G, C, E. Then we get to go back to the first one, the root position. Now we have our chord that's based on the fifth note of the scale. If we had the fifth note triad, it would be D, F sharp, G, right? Well, how did they change that to come up with what they have? They went ahead and changed it by throwing that, we'll see, we've got D, F sharp, A, and we're going to change it to where we have the F sharp on the bottom, and then we have A and D. So let's see what we did there. D, F sharp, A. It throws the D actually to the top. Look at that. Because we start with F sharp on the bottom. So we throw the D to the top, but they're going to have us stay down in the same octave as we started in. So we're going to have our F sharp, A, D. That D got thrown to the top. Now let's try our V7 chord. What's a V7 chord? Well, it's just a special chord that again sounds good in a lot of pieces, so it's often used. So V, remember, is our Roman numeral 5, stands for the 5th note of the chord, which is D. And so if we just had a V, a position 5 triad, it would be our D, F sharp, A. Well, a 7 adds another note up here that's a 7th above the D. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? And then they just decided we don't need 4 notes. We're going to throw out this A. So we just have D, F sharp, C here in this instance, right? That would be the V7 chord if we didn't invert it at all, right? So what they decided to do, they decided to throw the D to the top again. So we're going to start on the F sharp instead, and we'll stay down here where we started so we don't have to move our hand too much. F sharp, and then we've got our C, and we've got our D, right? So as we threw the D to the top. And then we go back to the original, let's do that with both hands. F sharp, C, D. And then we go back to our first position, G, B, D. So let's do that together. G, B, D, G, C, E, G, B, D, F sharp, A, D, F sharp, C, D, G, B, D. Now you notice that they didn't exactly, they didn't have this do the same thing to each chord to make it be easier to play, this first position, did they? Sometimes they threw the top note to the bottom, sometimes they threw the bottom note to the top. Well, you'll be glad to hear that the second position is easier. The second position is just when they decide to invert it again. So maybe instead of starting here, the composer wants them to start the first position a little higher up. Maybe it would sound better. So they're going to throw the bottom note up to the top. We're going to invert it again. Now we're going to have B, D, G. So that's the way all of these are changed. All of them just throw the bottom note of what we had in the first position to the top, and that's how it's changed. So let's go through this. We have our first chord based on the first note of the scale, but we threw that G to the top. So now the second position has the G at the top. We have B, D, G. Right? Then let's do that with both hands. B, D, G. Then let's do the one that's based on the fourth note of the scale. So before, in first position, we had G, C, E. But now we're going to invert it again. We're throwing that G to the top. So we'll start on the C. C, E, G. Let's do it with both hands. C, E, G. Then we're going to go back to the first one that we just did. B, D, G. Now let's take a look at the one based on the fifth note of the scale. In the first position, we had F sharp, A, D. Well, now we're going to throw that F sharp to the top. And we're going to start on A instead. A, D, F sharp. Let's try that with both hands. A, D, F sharp. Then we're going to do our V7 chord. Before we had F sharp, C, D in first position. We're throwing that F sharp to the top. We'll now start with C, D, and then F sharp on the top. Let's try that with both hands. C, D, F sharp. Then we go back to the first one again. B, D, G. So all together, B, D, G, C, E, G, B, D, G, A, D, F sharp, C, D, F sharp, and B, D, G again. We don't have to move our hands very far. Now let's go to the third position. We're going to invert everything one more time. So we were on B, D, G. We're going to invert it one more time. Throw that B to the top. Then we'll start on the D, D, G, B. Try that with both hands. D, G, based on the fourth note of the scale. Before we had C, G. We're throwing that C to the top. We'll start on the E this time. E, G, C. Try that with both hands. E, G, C. Back to the first one. D, G, B. Now we're going to do the one based on the fifth note of the scale. In the second position we had A, D, F sharp. Now we're throwing that A to the top. We're going to start on D, F sharp, and then A. Try that with both hands. D, F sharp, A. And then we'll do the B7. In second position we had C, D, F sharp. We're throwing the C to the top. We'll start on D, then do F sharp, and then C at the top. Let's try that with both hands. D, F sharp, and then C. And then we go back to the first one again. D, G, B. So all together, D, G, B. Then we have E, G, C. Back to D, B, G. D, F sharp, A. D, F sharp, C. And D, G, B. And that's your G major cadences. 3 positions.